Sattler Files.
Welcome back to the Sattler Files, and of course we've been inundated in the past little while with the budget announcements, and a man that knows a bit about money and knows a bit about budgets and knows a bit about finance and lots about business from the Stratosfear itself. Jamie Holroyd, how are you?
Yeah, thanks, Tom.
The budget, what do you make of it?
Oh, look, I think it was a little bit underwhelming. I think it was steady she goes. It's hard to know what people were expecting. You're coming into an election, so there's not a lot of room to move, and the government's got to save something up its sleeve to announce during the election campaign. So,
don't you think that the budget announcement really, and particularly given we're only less than 2 months away now, that the budget announcement itself was actually part of the election campaign?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's been quite a few commentators, which I have to agree with a little bit, in saying this is kind of a non-budget because we're going to have an election, so it almost might become redundant and irrelevant. But I suppose what it does do is it, sets the tone for the government going forward into the election campaign. So
it wasn't, as you said, it was a bit underwhelming. I have to say, I was expecting not so much rabbits out of the hat, but I was expecting something a bit bold. And I cast my mind back. What is it now? 7 months since Turnbull took over, and there was this sort of real optimism about Turnbull taking over. Abbott obviously hadn't engaged with the marketplace. Turnbull was going to ride in on the white horse and save the world, and he was this great innovator and everything else. And I think the 7 months so far, and the way the honeymoon period has fallen away, you'd have to say that the 7 months would have to be described as underwhelming. In many ways.
I think that as I was driving in here, I was listening to quite a few, Joe Everidge's, all the media outlets are doing run around talking to Joe Everidge about what they think of the budget. And, if we bring it back to a business and a business owner's context, what do they think? I think the response is pretty good, right? So what has become concerning over the last couple of years is governments obviously buying votes with sweeteners, and as much as even the people who might receive those might enjoy them, I think there seems to be a mood, not just in Australia, but pretty well around the world, that governments are living outside their means. So the response so far seems to be that people are pretty happy that there's not too many bells and whistles and too many sweeteners in this budget. And someone made the point to me the other day, which is, wasn't lost on me, but that when Kevin Rudd was standing for election in 2007, and there's normally an election campaign, there's one or two moments where everyone goes, yeah, that's probably right, and the tone gets set and things go in a certain direction. And one of the comments, which I would have to agree with, there was a moment when you might recall Kevin Rudd said, "This reckless spending must stop."
Yes.
Right? Not that he adhered to that later on, but during the campaign.
But it was a good statement.
But I think during the campaign, everybody says, yeah, I reckon you're right, and I think we're probably at that sort of point again. But
And I think, people generally, I think, accept that tax is necessary in order to have services, so therefore, a fair taxing system is acceptable. And therefore, if we need to contribute to, if we want better schools and hospitals and roads and services and everything else, it's going to cost us something. I think most people get their head around that concept. So therefore, the concept, let's start with the small business tax deduction. That would appear on the surface to be a sweetener of sorts. The threshold and the definition of small business obviously changes over the next couple of years to the point where it's all business, not just small business. And, the company tax being reduced. The impact, what's that going to do?
Oh, look, I think sometimes these things are more about setting the tone and the sentiment, right? So I'm not a fan at all of differential tax rates for business. So it just adds more complexity, right? So typically any sort of differentiation you have or exception, people work, the economy puts an enormous amount of effort to go into work ways around it, right?
Yeah.
So what happens, when the threshold's 10 million, what do people do to make sure they stay under 10 million? Do they start another company?
Well, isn't that actually the core of this whole tax evasion thing of big corporations, where they set up multiple companies and then funnel money off so they're all $9 million companies?
I prefer the word minimisation.
Minimisation, okay, sorry. Yes, we'll use that terminology.
So the difference being, for the listeners out there, just a nuance, is that minimisation is something you're doing legally, and avoidance obviously is something you're doing illegally. So.
But I think there's been some confusion over the word evasion, hasn't there? Evasion sort of sits in the middle. It's neither illegal or illegal, but it's not desirable.
Yeah, and look, I've made this point before, and I know people talk about it a lot, but, the companies that we work with and we see all the time, most people are pretty honest, decent people. They can't afford a scandal. If you've got, as your business grows, and if you start to earn a couple of $1 million, if you multiply that by 4 and 5 times, you're talking about a substantial amount of money. You can't afford to put that at risk by, trying to save a few bucks on tax and doing something dodgy. So the perception that all these companies don't pay tax and all these sorts of things, it's the perception does not match reality. Right? I'll give you a classic example.
Well, it's not the mid-sized company, is it? Isn't what we're talking about? We're talking about big corporations that put really complex systems in place, which would appear to be, and you know more about this than I do, but would appear to be, and that seems to be the perception in the marketplace, that they are avoiding one way or another by just hiving stuff off overseas or into. The whole Cayman thing came up and all the rest of the stuff.
And I'll tell you when this becomes relevant, Tom. If you go back at least over the last 25 years, probably before then, and if you're in opposition and you make wild promises and you say, how are we going to pay for this? And the chestnut comes out as, well, we'll crack down on tax avoidance, right? And this is nothing new, and it's always a great way. And the public goes, yeah, you should do that. And it seems like a credible thing, but I can't remember a time when the budget was suddenly balanced because there was a crackdown on tax avoidance or tax minimisation. It suddenly had a big outcome. And whenever I hear it or see it, I just almost put a line through it.
The figure that was thrown around about them cracking down on that, it's costing, $120 million in additional resources for ASIC to be able to monitor that. And I think the outcome was only about he says, about 3.7 or 3.9 billion, which, is a lot of money. But in the scheme of things, it's not. When you talk about the sort of numbers that were thrown around only a few weeks ago when this whole Cayman thing surfaced.
Yeah, and I mentioned this the last couple of weeks, Tom, but you could raise more money than that by cracking down on fringe benefits tax for the tradie with his ute and his mobile phone. Right?
Yeah,
so,
not as popular though, is
it? Clearly not as popular. But it's almost harking back to the old days. You'd say on budget night you used to wake up and say, well, there'll be an increase in cigarettes, increase in beer, and there'll be a crackdown in tax avoidance, and we all move on, right?
Yeah.
And but the thing that's interesting, and we'll talk a bit about budget forecasting, but you might recall that about 4 years ago we were supposed to be standing around celebrating today because we'd been surplus, right? And we'd be significantly in surplus. And when I looked at the numbers last night, it looked like it was a $40 billion deficit for this year. And sometimes the word billion rolls off the tongue pretty well.
Yeah, you can say it quickly.
Yeah.
It sort
of
rolls.
In a traditional sense, a billion used to be a million, but more commonly, a billion is referred to as 1,000 million. So $40,000 million we've spent more than we've earned. So now for the next couple of years, Tom, I just did a quick calculation. So this year's budget deficit, $39.9 billion.
Yep.
Next year, $37 billion. Now that number has been around that for the past 5 or 6 years. It hasn't really moved at all. We're forecast with some fairly heroic assumptions for another $26 billion after that, and then another $15 billion, and then $6 billion, and then we assume in the outer year we'll probably be back in surplus at that point. But that's $125,000 million over the next 5 years.
The commentators last night watching the reports and such. Scott Morrison copped a bit of a flogging, I thought, particularly on the ABC, about the fact that the Liberal Party came in on the basis that the Labor Party under Gillard and Rudd had spent too much and it was reckless and everything else. And the level of spending has actually increased or at least stayed the same. Certainly in terms of, and I know Lee Sales and the ABC harped on this, and it was on a percentage of GDP. Now, that can be a little bit deceptive if your revenue model has come down, because if you've got less income but you're spending the same amount of money, then obviously your percentage as a ratio goes up. So therefore, the percentage of GDP almost becomes irrelevant other than to make a good argument.
Well, if you speak to Peter Costello, he'll tell you that if you reduce spending to the level it was before the GFC, you'd be in surplus right now. So with the same revenue collection. So Now, look, why is this important? Why is it important for business? The reason that a budget surplus is important is the more deficits you run, the more you risk that taxes are going to go up at some point in the future. And when taxes go up, it undermines investment. So, often I'm a business owner, I might make fairly significant investments in equipment, in, strategic decision-making, and that can be undermined by a stroke of a pen. Now, I'll give you a couple of examples over the last few years, and we certainly had a period where they were, happening all the time, but maybe not in a tax sense, but, the government stopped the live export trade. Now, for the listeners at home and people turn on the TV, well, is that much impact? But if you've got a business that you spent 25 years building and someone makes a change like that, it can destroy you overnight. The other thing we talk a lot about, the Pink Bats program, but too bad if you're an installer who'd built your business around installing Pink Bats and suddenly got 1,000 more competitors that join the market. And these kind of arbitrary decisions made without a lot of thought. And that's why I think sometimes a nice, boring, steady as you go budget's actually a good thing. So,
well, it'll be interesting to see where the government goes to from here, because they've got 2 months to come up with something else that does engage the market, because obviously the budget hasn't. And it wasn't designed to. But the impact of, like, for instance, the corporate tax reduction, the rate, the concessions that were given to companies earlier or last year, effectively, in terms of write-offs and such, didn't seem to stimulate growth to the extent that they wanted to. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a trend here too. The things get announced and everyone gets onto it.
Yeah.
And it all happens with a flurry, and then people tend to forget about it.
Yeah.
And the reverse is also true. When things are about to expire, sometimes people get stuck into things too. So I still remember before the GST, there was like this housing where everyone on the street was building a fence or putting up a veranda because they thought the next day it's going to be 10% dearer. So
the other major announcement, I suppose, in terms of business is this program of internships and the subsidies there. It's not a massively bold step or anything else, and it's not particularly costly, but it is a step to sort of addressing particularly youth unemployment, isn't it?
Well, look, this is the sort of announcement I really like, right? Now, I know the union has been out this morning already bagging it, but the reason I like it so much is it's one of those things where you don't have to throw enormous amounts of money at something to fix it, right? Now, I'll give you some stats, Tom. I did some research just before I came here this morning, but in WA alone, there's about 221,000 small businesses. And by small businesses, we mean businesses that employ less than 200 people. So no business employs 200 people is a reasonable size. Now, if you have 221,000 businesses and they only employ one person extra, well, unemployment's going to be pretty well solved, right?
Yeah.
Now, the part of the problem with unemployment is people who are unemployed for a significant period of time tend to stay unemployed for a long period of time. Now, in certain areas in the country where we have sort of socioeconomic disadvantage, and typically those old housing commission type areas where you have intergenerational unemployment, right? And so it becomes very difficult to build any momentum. Now, for those who haven't caught up with the announcement, what the government's planning to do is offer, short-term internships of 12 to 14 weeks. If you're on the dole or unemployment benefit, you get an extra $100 a week. So you get to keep your dole and you get an extra $100. So suddenly you've got some motivation to go and do something. The company then can take you on for 3 months, and they get paid $1,000 as well. So there's incentives on both sides. Now, one of the things I think is fantastic is to take someone and give them an opportunity that they wouldn't normally get otherwise. And I think this will actually help. It'll actually help expose people to industries. I can almost test drive a job. The company doesn't need to invest long-term and take a risk. It lowers that risk. I think it's a really good outcome, to be honest. I'm really excited to see how it works. And even for ourselves, I woke up this morning thinking, oh, geez, I might look at this ourselves and get some sort of young intern into the office and see where we can go with that. So,
good call. The other announcement yesterday, and weird timing, having the interest rate announcement from the Reserve Bank yesterday as well, with an unexpected cut in rates, which flowed through, affected the market, and caught everyone off guard a little bit by the sounds of it. Yeah,
Tom, look, the Reserve Bank has this kind of revenants, right? And they're kind of like the wise old men, and they don't get criticised too much, but I like to think I'm out on the outer because they do things that I just don't agree with, and I struggle to understand them. And there's kind of this utopian view that everyone agrees with what the Reserve Bank says and does. Now, if I went back through history, there's 3 or 4 obvious things that they really got wrong. Now, if you go back to the last recession we had, for those people who don't recall, interest rates went up and up and up, and they clearly put them up too high and left them too high for too long. It was obvious that was a mistake, and they did that. During the 2007 election campaign, in the middle of the election campaign, they put interest rates up, right? I thought it was incredibly political. There's no reason why I couldn't have waited another month. Also, at that stage, the GFC was really starting to unravel in America. That was obvious that was happening, and it was just a ridiculous decision, I thought, to put interest rates up at that moment. And I think yesterday was another one. Like, why you would put interest rates down when there's a budget to be announced, I just find it odd.
Do you think they've done it in preference to do it next month in the middle of an election campaign?
Well, I just think the timing's odd, Tom. And now, look, we have this general persona that interest rates going down is a great thing. Now, if I'm a homeowner and I go to work and I'm trying to pay off my mortgage, it is a good thing, right? It does help. But the one thing it does do, it does drive housing prices up. Now, during the early part of the 2000s, when housing prices, after a long period of time, really started to escalate, there's been all sorts of theories about why house prices go up, right? We blame negative gearing. We blame the lack of supply. If you halve the cost of interest, you'll double the cost of the house, right?
Yeah.
There's a fairly obvious relationship there. And when at a time when people are worried about a property bubble, for the Reserve Bank to put interest rates down even lower, I think it's odd.
It's and it sort of it got mixed in with the whole equation yesterday with the budget last night, and it was a really strange day having both announcements on the same day.
Yeah. And look, I think that from my perspective is if interest rates, the Reserve Bank cash rate was at 2%. Now, if people aren't running out and borrowing at 2%, are they really going to run out and borrow more at 1.75? Right?
And clearly, you're probably not going to do it from the ANZ, who didn't even pass on the whole cut.
Well, look, you'd have to say if interest rates are as low as they need to be and you cut more, are you actually just going to hand the opportunity to the banks to increase margin? And no shock, surprise, one bank took that opportunity.
Yeah.
And I would have said that was predictable as well.
Yep.
So,
very much so.
now, part of the problem for poor banks, right, is if you at one point cut more than everyone else and you're cheaper, then suddenly it gets really hard without copying a lot of political flack for not passing on the whole interest rate. So now in a perfect world, if banks were really, truly competitive, all the banks would have the same cost pressure and you'd see the same rises throughout the industry. So sometimes it's a bit of a hint as to what's really going on.
The other impact of both announcements yesterday, both the budget and the interest rates, obviously for retirees, changes to superannuation and thresholds and obviously the tax rates, but also with interest rates dropping, has a direct impact on retirees as well.
Yeah, lower interest rates has a whole bunch of unintended consequences. So, as I said, our predominant thought is normally it's good for home buyers. It's clearly not good for retirees. Retirees might have saved, if you had $1 million in the bank, Tom, if you're getting interest rate of 1% on it, it's not a lot of money.
No.
Right? So, and it's not a lot of reward for that saving. The other thing we talk about house prices, it's not just retirees, but, one of the challenges for young kids trying to get into the housing market now, if interest rates are 10%, it makes it easier to save money, right? If you're getting no return almost on your money, it actually makes it harder to save a deposit for a house, and that's a kind of a subject that no one's really talked about. But we might have mentioned this previously that the unintended consequence of a lot of this is what's happening is shareholders then go chasing dividend yields. Now, the best way to increase your dividend yield is to not spend money on capital expenditure, to save up your cash and then pay it as a dividend. Now, what that means is less economic activity, not more. So the theory goes, if you lower interest rates, people borrow more and you get more activity. Well, that may not necessarily be the case anymore. So you add it all together and I don't think it does a lot. So now the other thing, Tom, I wanted to really stress is why did the Reserve Bank do this? Now, they did it because the inflation numbers were low. In fact, they were negative, right? And if you look at the breakdown of why was it negative, a very large component of that was a reduction in the petrol price.
Yes.
And I look at that and say, is that going to happen again? No. So why would you do it? It's also the first period of data where that's happened. So unless you thought there was something really negative coming, and maybe they got some insights that we don't have, but I thought it was probably overreaction. So.
Because they set that parameter. They want inflation to be hovering between 2 and 3%. And they're saying the rate had dropped to 1.5. And as you said, largely because of oil prices and fuel prices. So, and there still doesn't seem to be, I suppose, the housing market, the impact that Sydney and Melbourne has is disproportionate to the rest of Australia. And therefore, it has all sorts of weird and wonderful effects all over the place, doesn't it?
Well, look, I sit there and I always bring this back to what is the business owner thinking, right? Now, let's say I'm looking at a new widget machine. Things are pretty tough. If I buy my new widget machine, maybe it makes things a bit easier, more productive, but it's still a significant investment, right? So it's not without risk. I'm sitting there thinking today, should I do this or should I not? Reserve Bank cuts interest rates. We've got deflation. Does that give you confidence or reduce confidence? Does the Reserve Bank cutting interest rates in that environment actually mean that business has less confidence?
Well, the figures I was seeing last week is that consumer confidence is actually rising, but business confidence isn't, which is interesting because normally the two are much more closely aligned. Yeah. But at the moment, business is sort of sitting back, partly, I suppose, because of the election cycle that's there as it is, but also business conditions. And, of course, the ever-present stories about China and all the rest of the stuff that we're faced with every day.
Yeah, and look, I'm always conscious that, we've got listeners just beyond WA, and clearly that both of us are based in WA, so that's always our focus. But certainly in the last couple of weeks, the people we've been speaking to said they've never seen it as tough as it is at the moment. So now, if you put that into context, say, well, why would that be the case, right? Now, WA has had an unprecedented investment boom. So Western Australia is the largest source of US foreign capital investment in the world, right? And if you think about it, Tom, just in some really round numbers for the listeners, but the Gorgon Gas Project, they spent about $60 billion on that, right? So you throw in a few other projects, let's say over the last 4 or 5 years, spent about $100 billion in investment. You say that's been done over 4 or 5 years, that's about $20 billion a year.
Yep.
That's stopped, gone to zero, right?
It's a big drop.
It's clearly going to have an impact, right?
Yeah.
And this is where I think that the switch really is. So it used to be if interest rates went down, car sales would rocket the next day, right? Or there'd be an increase in housing demand, or people would sit around and wait for the Treasurer to pull a rabbit out of the hat and sell off Qantas or sell off the Commonwealth Bank and balance the budget, and everything would move on. And that's what I'd call the macroeconomic setting. We don't even hear that term used anymore.
No.
But business confidence would be very much driven by that. I think it's almost irrelevant, right? I don't think the business owner now sits around thinking the government's going to come and save me, or there's going to be some change, or it's all about the micro level. It's about the business unit level, and what can we do to be more productive and more efficient.
So if that's the case, as we talk about forecasts, and you did your forward forecast, the possibility of us actually reaching surplus in, 2021, it would be about the same as probably the odds that Leicester started the season at.
Yeah.
I would imagine.
Leicester actually did win.
Yes.
That's a known outcome.
But the odds they started the season at 5,000 to 1, you'd have to think, based on historical data of the last decade or so, that the chances of us actually reaching a surplus are zero and none.
Well, look, this is a really good point, Tom, and it's happened for the last 4 or 5 years. And if you go back and search through the internet, and particularly through the Wayne Son period celebrating our return to surplus, which still hasn't happened, right?
Yes.
So you and I were joking before, but saying that we're meant to be in surplus right now, but that data was about 4 years old. Now, why is that? Because what happens is the budget is typically framed around what we'd call heroic assumptions, right? So this is the outcome that we want. So how do we take a little bit here and tweak a little bit there and steer the outcome to what we want, right? So it's and this is what a lot of companies might do too.
Sort of spreadsheet millionaire.
Well, exactly right, right? So you're actually making the parameters fit the outcome, not the other way around, right? So typically, and I use this example, the government wants to come out with a story about us returning to surplus. Now, what happens is it's quite ironic that there's always this hoopla around the budget. What does it mean? All the analysis. And when we get to the next year, as in this year, it's like no one actually cares what the result is, right? No one's actually even focused on what the result is. No one cares that we were supposed to be in surplus years ago and we've got a $40 billion deficit at the moment. Now, what happens in a business context is it might be the bank, for example, says, look, if you want to borrow money, we need a budget forecast. And so someone in the organisation, maybe the accountant, maybe the bookkeeper, puts together a budget. Everybody looks at it and goes, that looks all right, and then it goes in a drawer, all right?
Yep.
Now, if you compare that with, and I say the ultimate budget is a one-day cricket match, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the one-day cricket match is we need 250 runs.
In 50 overs.
In 50 overs. So we know exactly how many runs per over we need. We know when it's achievable, and we know that if it's, say, 6 runs and over, I've got to score off every ball. If I don't score off this ball, I've got to get 2 off the next ball.
Yep.
If I hit a 4 in the first delivery of the over, I've got a bit of fat up my sleeve, right? And that's exactly how a business should operate. It should say, listen, we don't just say, oh, well, the iron ore price went down and we're $40 billion worse in the hole than we thought. We say, all right, well, what are we going to do? If we're committed to a surplus, if that parameter changes, what else have we got to play with to make sure that we get the outcome that we said we're going to have? Someone said to me once, your budget is your promise, right? You don't go around breaking promises and you don't make them lightly. So, what have you got to play with, and how do you get the outcome that you need? So, exactly like one-day cricket, if you fall behind, you've got to lift the intensity to catch up. It's not just a scoreboard or a storybook. It should be a living document that you monitor regularly. Now, if you want to hit any sort of goal, look at it all the time. Now, particularly one-day cricket, you see the run rate comes over every over. As it gets closer to the end, start changing the budget, we'll call it, changes every ball. Right.
Yep. And how many wickets you have in hand comes into play and that sort of stuff.
How much risk you're going to take to try and come out with that outcome.
Yep.
Now, if you've got lots of wickets in hand, you can take a fair bit of risk, right?
Correct, because you've got other guys to come into bat. If you're 8 wickets down, you're in trouble.
Yeah,
yep.
Yeah. And exactly. So a company balance sheet is almost like how many wickets have I got in hand? How much risk can I afford to take? Now, clearly, if you've got last man out's game over, well, you can't take too much risk at all. So, And that said, a budget, the company should review it regularly, not once a year, not once a half or a quarter. Ideally, you'd want to be looking at it all the time. So,
well, that's an interesting point because there is so much emphasis on June 30 as well in business, whereas June 30 really is just another date. It's for tax purposes. That's your close-off date for the year's figures, but it doesn't actually alter anything about your operation, does it?
Well, look, one of the things we talk about, Tom, and we do this every year, but by about September, October, we start to get stuck into people. So we say, all right, this is how it's going to work. If you don't have a pipeline that's leading to you hitting your budget, if you're not going to make it before Christmas, and then people shut down over Christmas, and then you've got to come back and rebuild momentum. So if you haven't got your one-day run rate on target by September, October, there's a fair chance you're not going to make it.
Yeah.
So, and it's predictable that far out. So, and then you're relying on, some sort of hitting a 6, off a good delivery, to try and make your budget. So, and clearly, that involves more risk. So.
In terms of taking that equation to running a business and your forecasts and everything else, the lessons out of the budget and the current economic, environment that we're in, I suppose, from that point of view, what lessons are there, and what messages are both you delivering, but also what messages are you getting from the marketplace?
Well, look, I think the simple thing is that what happens in politics and popular media is there's a narrative, right? And there's a narrative that, and then often what happens is we all go looking for circumstances and events that fit that narrative and say, see, this is correct, right? Now, part of the problem over the last couple of years is people said, well, the Howard government was in surplus because we had a mining boom, right? Well, they did a lot of hard work, right? They brought in the GST, they sold off Telstra, they did the work, right? And often it's easy to explain away sometimes hard work is good luck.
Yeah.
But, the reason we're struggling is in the last 10 years, no one's been prepared to do the work. And, Tom, you talk about the budget, and I don't want to bore the listeners with my favourite topic, but, why we're not, broadening the base of the GST to get rid of payroll tax, and we'll all be poorer for it. And, in WA, that's a 5.5% payroll tax. So if you got someone on $100,000, it's $5,500 that you're, paying for no return. And we've got a few businesses we've been in work with over the last couple of years, and I might have mentioned this before. I always go through the profit and loss. Why isn't the company working? What's it spending money on? And for these two businesses, both turn over about $10 million. There's $150,000 a year payroll tax. Tax on employment.
It's a big impost.
It is huge. So, if you really were serious about employment, you're serious about making Australia competitive, that would be your prime focus to get rid of. So,
the political will and the timing of the budget with the election, the two of them coming concurrently in that sense, do you think that has probably taken the edge off what the Turnbull government was able to do in the budget, that they've had to be a bit more conservative?
Oh, look, I would think so. I mean, it's a tricky environment. Now, one of the challenges is, so we're all cynical about all these things, right? Now, you might recall for the younger listeners, is that 1993, John Hewson released what they call the Fight Back package.
Yes.
600-odd pages, manifesto, everything we're going to do. It was kind of like How to Run a Country 101, right? And that got released, and what happened was all the government at the time did is pick through it and start to scare people, right? And so from that point on, you will never see that sort of detail released ever again, right? And it hasn't been. It's over 20 years now since that happened, but that's just not the way it works. Now, the other thing is, Jeff Kennett used to talk about this, is that he actually got the budget into such a good position that he said, well, basically what happens is if you leave a surplus, all you're doing is leaving ammunition for the opposition to spend it, right? Yeah. And start promising things. So it's a tricky dynamic for a government to be brave enough to make the right calls. So
we're in for an interesting ride for the next 60 days, aren't we?
Look, I think what people are looking for would be business confidence, and clearly, depending on your political views, that But do we need another change of Prime Minister? Clearly that wouldn't be great. Whoever wins the election, we hope that they have a clear mandate and can get on and do things. And I think that's what people have been waiting for a long period of time. We had the hung parliament. And I say this to a lot of people and, it's kind of, recalibrate history. But, Clive Palmer doesn't come along and Tony Abbott had control of the Senate. It would be a very, very different view of history. And his political narrative would be completely different. He would have almost gone down in history as one of the most sort of powerful, successful, political leaders, but that's not what happened, and the world's a different place. And not saying whether that's right or wrong, but often politics hangs on a moment, and we're just looking for business needs business confidence and business certainty, and it doesn't need a lot of changes. And Tom, one of the problems I think with the budget in the last couple of years is every time the budget's got into real difficulty, is that government has gone to changes to superannuation to fix it, right? And I think because it happens, in your savings, people don't see it, so it's a nice political thing. But what it means is it reduces people's confidence to invest, and that's what we all need to carry things forward. So,
yeah, very much so. To contact you and have a discussion about what you can do with people's business.
Yeah, certainly, Tom. If people want to call me directly, they can. My phone number is 0422 907 902, and if people want to have a look at the Stratosfear website, it's stratosfear.com.au, and that's Stratosfear with an F.
Yep, FEAR on the end, yes, and always interesting, and we'll catch up with you again very shortly.
All right, thanks, Tom.
Jamie Holroyd from Stratosfear talking about the fallout and otherwise the outcomes from the budget, and we'll be back with more very shortly on the Sattler Files.
This is the Sattler Files.